And tens of thousands of demonstrators held a second straight weekend of anti-Japanese protests, and police did little to stop the violence as the mobs went on a rampage.
Yes, and Japan is taking it very badly. The Japanese foreign minister said he will lodge a strong official protest when he visits Beijing tomorrow. It's estimated that up to 20,000 people took to the streets in Shanghai alone, and there was chaos in front of the Japanese consulate there. Another 10,000 rallied in the eastern city of Hangzhou and 2,000 in Tianjin, southeast of Beijing, while there were smaller protests in Shenzhen and here in Hong Kong as well. We begin in Shanghai, the scene of today's biggest and most violent protest. It was chaos again as anti-Japanese feelings boiled over and mob violence was the order of the day, this time in Shanghai. As many as 20,000 people marched to the Japanese consulate, and when they got there, scuffles broke out between the demonstrators and hundreds of riot police. Some even climbed on top of the vehicle and tried to force their way into the compound. Police wouldn't let the mob get inside, but did nothing as they threw rocks, eggs, and bottles, covering the walls of the building with debris. Mobs ransacked a two-story Japanese restaurant, breaking inside and smashing all the windows. And the protesters damaged several other Japanese restaurants and bars along the way, even though they were Chinese-owned. And this is what they did to Japanese business signs. The mobs encouraged Westerners to join as well. Japanese invaders must die, they chanted. All this fury began recently after Tokyo approved a history textbook that whitewashes Japan's Second World War atrocities against China. Japan's bid to join the United Nations Security Council inflamed them further. Japanese consulate spokesman Ide Keiji said he had lodged a strong official protest over the violence.
It's quite regrettable that, again, violent illegal actions took place in Shanghai toward our Consulate General Office building.
Japanese Foreign Minister Nobutaka Machimura said he will take matters a step further when he visits Beijing tomorrow and voices government's condemnation of the violence during a meeting with his Chinese counterpart. He said what happened today was extremely regrettable, given that security measures were not good enough, and he even had unconfirmed reports that Japanese nationals were injured in the chaos.
Anti-Japanese sentiments ran high in other parts of the mainland, where thousands of protesters took to the streets, demanding that Japan apologize for its wartime atrocities. Beijing was spared the chaotic scenes in Shanghai today, a stark contrast after last week's anti-Japanese riots. That's because security was extremely tight in the capital, with police out in force and riot squads on standby. Authorities had already warned against unapproved or harmful actions, and paramilitary police made their presence felt outside the Japanese embassy and ambassador's residence. Rumors had been circulating on the internet over the past few days that anti-Japanese rallies would be held in Tiananmen Square, but there was nothing of that sort today, and police made sure it stayed that way. Beijing may have managed to stay quiet for now, but the protest in Shanghai spread to Hangzhou, the capital of Zhejiang province. Some 10,000 people, mostly students, marched in the downtown area of the city to take part in large-scale demonstrations against Japan. Anti-Japanese protests also spread to the port city of Tianjin in northern China, which attracted around 2,000 demonstrators. And another protest, although on a much smaller scale, was seen in Shenzhen. A handful of demonstrators marched to one of the city's Japanese department stores, but unlike in previous rallies over the past week, passers-by chose not to join this time.
In tit-for-tat violence, the home of China's ambassador to Tokyo has been vandalized with red paint. Despite the worrying developments, some Japanese schools continue to use the controversial textbooks at the center of the storm. ATV's Yantan Latu has that part of the story.
The Tokyo residence of China's ambassador to Japan became a target in the bitter row between the two countries. The doorplate, mailbox and intercom were splashed with red paint and graffiti late last night. Tokyo police blamed the attack on the growing tension between China and Japan. And just hours earlier, the Chinese consulate in Osaka received a threatening letter that also contained a razor blade. Beijing has made a strong protest to Japan, asking Tokyo to catch the culprits and ensure the safety of Chinese diplomats. At the center of the storm are the history textbooks approved by Tokyo that gloss over Japan's wartime atrocities. But the Reuters news agency reports that only 18 out of Japan's more than 11,000 junior high schools are using the controversial textbooks, and this is one of them. The principal said there's nothing wrong with the book, and it's been over 50 years since Japan decided not to engage in war. While the ongoing row is causing concern around the world, Singapore's former Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew said the heightened tension between China and Japan is unlikely to lead to war because of the horrendous consequences. And the European Union has called on Beijing and Tokyo to take steps to calm the situation. In South Korea, where citizens are also angry about the textbooks, academics say Japan must take responsibility for its past wrongdoings.
The bottom line is that Japan was the aggressor and Korea was the victim, and nobody can turn that around.
Ironically, the media coverage of the controversy has given a huge publicity boost to the Japanese history textbooks, and sales have jumped to 600,000 copies.
The anti-Japanese sentiment sweeping the mainland is also stirring up feelings here in Hong Kong. Several groups rallied outside the Japanese consulate today, and a bigger demonstration is planned for tomorrow. But Japanese officials here say they're not worried about the violence. Anghara James reports.
The orderly groups who made their way to the Japanese consulate here in Hong Kong were in stark contrast to the anti-Japanese violence on the mainland. Even those with the most cause to be angry, Second World War veterans, were content to shout a few slogans and leave behind a letter of protest. The Democratic Party tried to rally the young and old to sign a petition against Japan. Activists collected signatures in Tsuen Wan today, part of a bigger campaign to convince the Japanese government to withdraw the offending textbooks. A survey shows the textbook issue is stirring up public sentiment here. 94% of respondents were angry at how history had been rewritten. 73% said it had damaged their impression of Japan. 90% said China and the international community should put more pressure on Japan to change its stance on the issue. But they were divided over whether boycotting Japanese goods would do any good. At an event to promote friendship between Japan and Hong Kong today, Japanese Consul General Takanori Kitamura said he's convinced tomorrow's protest here will be a peaceful one.
I recognize this as part of the free and the pluralistic society, and at the same time I'm quite convinced that this demonstration will be very peaceful.
He said it will be business as usual at the consulate tomorrow, where there will be no additional security measures. Anghara James, ATV News.
Turning to other news, reform or die. That's the latest message to the United Nations from U.S. Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice. It's the strongest criticism of the world body so far by a top U.S. official, and comes as a debate on what shape the reforms should take is underway. ATV's Ben O'Rourke reports.
In the Bush administration's latest attack on the United Nations,
Wen Jiabao told reporters in New Delhi when he was asked about the wave of anti-Japanese protests in China and Korea in recent days.
亚洲人民的这种强烈的反响，应该引起日本当局的深刻的反省。尊重历史的国家，敢于对历史负责的国家，能够赢得亚洲以至世界人民信任的国家，才能够在国际社会发挥更大的责任。
He cited opposition to Japan's attempt to become a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council and changes to history textbooks which protesters say whitewashed Japan's wartime atrocities. The call for Japan to reflect was echoed by the Foreign Ministry in Beijing. Spokesman Tian Gang sidestepped questions on whether China should offer an apology for damages to the Japanese embassy during demonstrations last weekend. Instead, he said the current situation in Sino-Japan relations is rooted on the Japanese side, though he added that the government does not condone the overreaction by some people. Activist Tong Zhang, though, insists the recent protests were reasonable. He has collected more than 20,000 letters denouncing Japan, many of them from people angry about changes made to history textbooks in Japan that played down Japanese atrocities in China during World War II. The letters will be sent to the United Nations to show Chinese sentiment toward Japan.
Beijing is also demanding that Tokyo better protect its nationals in Japan after a branch office of the Bank of China in Yokohama was apparently the target of an act of vandalism. 9 cracks were discovered in the glass door of a building housing the office, and police say the cracks could have been caused by an air gun. Tokyo, for its part, continued to speak out against the recent spate of anti-Japan protests on the mainland. Japanese Trade Minister Shoichi Nakagawa called China a scary country and expressed concerns about the impact of rising anti-Japanese sentiment on companies doing business in China. And Foreign Minister Nobutaka Machimura urged Beijing to respond to demands for an apology and compensation for damage caused by protesters during weekend anti-Japan rallies. Anti-Japanese feelings are also running high in South Korea. Prime Minister Lee Hae-chan says Seoul will not make concessions to Tokyo amid a row over a group of disputed islands. A group of South Koreans set sail for the rocky outpost known as Tokto in South Korea and Takeshima in Japan and read patriotic poems on board the boat. Students at a Tunmun secondary school received a history lesson today on Japan's actions during World War II. They later visited the Japanese Consulate General in Hong Kong, where they urged Japan, in their words, to face the truth about its past. Jameson Wong has details.
A lesson in patriotism for kids at this school in Tunmun this morning. The secondary school students were shown documentaries of Japan's attack on China during World War II. Teachers then encouraged them to discuss the recent anti-Japanese protests on the mainland, stressing that the violence involved was not right. This was the right way, according to activists from the new territories. They presented a petition to officials at the Japanese Consulate General. In addition to the textbook...
We heard on methods like this, and really this kind of interpretation